Theirs was the ultimate relationship between politics and show business.
Two men who had a real understanding of raw power, and they had great fun.
For a brief time in America's history, the President of the United States and the nation's most popular singer enjoyed an intimate and largely unknown friendship.
I know we're all indebted to a great friend, Frank Sinatra.
They shared an interest in politics, a love of good times, and a voracious appetite for women.
Jack Kennedy, he had enormous ambition and enormous sex drive.
But in 1962, their relationship abruptly ceased because of their links to organized crime and the woman they had shared with a gangster.
Kennedy was going to drop him like a hot potato if it in any way jeopardized his own political career.
This is the story of how Frank Sinatra became a part of JFK's life and why it all came crashing to a bitter end.
It was a mix that was sure to end in tragedy.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, Mr. John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy took to the stage of the Armory to acknowledge the contribution that another American icon, Frank Sinatra, had made to his election and to the organization of that evening's pre-inaugural gala.
Long before he could sing, he used to poll a Democratic precinct back in New Jersey. That precinct has grown to cover a country. But long after he has ceased to sing, he's going to be standing up and speaking for the Democratic Party, and I thank him on behalf of all of you tonight.
For Frank Sinatra, it marked his rehabilitation after years of disappointment and exclusion.
He now has a place at the table. He's invited to sit at the table in a completely legitimate fashion.
Sinatra could be volatile and vindictive, as well as charitable and charming.
Depending upon what kind of situation or scenario you were in, you could get one kind of Sinatra or you could get another kind of Sinatra.
Now, this most controversial entertainer was inside the White House and sitting at the top table.
This is everything that Frank Sinatra has been dreaming about. Crows out to his friends, this is it, we're on our way to the White House.
But Sinatra's glory would be short-lived. Just over a year later, he would be unceremoniously and ruthlessly ejected from the president's inner circle.
Frank was the greatest guy in the world, and Jack loved him, but you know, they were tough guys, and if it affected Jack's political prospects, it was over.
Hoboken, New Jersey, a long way from the glamour of the White House, but it's where the man who was to become the 20th century's greatest voice began his life.
Hoboken had started out in the 19th century as a place where a lot of millionaires had homes. But by the time Frank Sinatra was born, it was a shabby industrial town across the Hudson, of course, from Manhattan, but light years away in terms of the way that people lived.
This was a city like New York, like other cities around America, where Italian immigrants came into a kind of cauldron of a new culture.
It was a cauldron of the incomplete melting pot. They always speak of the melting pot. Well, it didn't melt so much. There were all these ethnicities that ground up against each other constantly.
Frank Sinatra was born into this cauldron in a tenement house on Monroe Street on December 12, 1915.
He was, in a sense, born into poverty. The Italians were the immigrants who were arriving after the Irish. The old way had been to abuse the Irish as people that you really didn't want in the country.
Since the Italians were more recent arrivals, they were looked down upon by everybody, including the Irish Americans. And so it was very tough in the streets of Hoboken. There were gangs of kids. If you went into the wrong neighborhood, if you happened to be Italian or if you happened to be Irish, easy to get beaten up, slugged over the head with a baseball bat.
But Frank's challenges began as his mother was giving birth to him.
A baby born only just alive, weighing 13.5 pounds.
Sinatra's mother was a force to be reckoned with.
Dolly was the go-getter. Frank's father was the silent type.
Dolly was a brilliant woman. She was tough, she was irascible, she was frequently obscene, but she was brilliant. In Hoboken, she was a political fixer of the first order.
She involved herself very much in local New Jersey politics as a Democrat. She's a registered Democrat. She had her political brain in the right place.
Dolly believed her political connections could get her where she wanted to go, to drag herself and her husband Marty up the social ladder, and to give Frank everything he wanted.
Sinatra inherited her kind of personality, very outgoing, very extroverted, almost a kind of stereotypical Italian personality.
Frank was a kid who grew up rather spoiled. As a teenager, he had his own charge account at the fanciest men's clothing store in town. He had his own bedroom. He had his own radio, which was a very big deal in the 1920s and 1930s. His mother bought him a car when he was 15 years old, and when he began to become interested in singing, Dolly bought him a little sound system. He had this convertible car, which enabled him to convince other musicians to work with him because they weren't automatically persuaded by the beauty of his voice. So that was really the beginning of his career.
The person Frank most of all wanted to emulate was his hero, Bing Crosby.
Bing Crosby was God in America in the 1930s.
Just one more word.
Bing Crosby was an evolution of popular singing. He took it to a place it had never been before.
After a few amateur performances locally, Frank announced he wanted to be a professional singer. And despite her reservations, Dolly was right behind him.
He dropped out of high school at 15 and really wanted to become a singer.
It was Dolly that really was pushing, although both of them, when he announced he was going to be a singer, his father said, "You're going to be a bum," and his mother threw a shoe at him. So this was not exactly encouragement. But her iron will, she passed on to him, and it was like he wanted to show Dolly, "I'm going to be great."
But to get into the big time, Frank needed to make some new friends. The entertainment business in northern New Jersey was largely controlled by organized crime.
Sinatra encountered the friends of the friends, the Cosa Nostra, the Mafia, the mobsters in northern New Jersey very early in his career.
And it was a relationship which was to haunt him for the rest of his life, and one which his mother had already cultivated.
Dolly naturally knew them through her political activities, through her power connections in northern New Jersey, and Sinatra early on acquired a northern New Jersey godfather, a mafioso, a man named Willie Moretti, who helped Frank to get jobs.
Willie Moretti was a small-time thug, but big time for those places in New Jersey.
He got an audition to see whether he was any good to sing in the New York clubs with Willie Moretti, and Willie Moretti was a gangster extremely close to Lucky Luciano.
Luciano, often referred to as the godfather of organized crime, was one of America's most prominent mobsters. Willie Moretti was to feature prominently in Frank's future and was his first real connection with his mother's more dubious associates. And her friends in the mob soon delivered for Frank.
In the late 30s, he got this big job as a singing waiter at a place called the Rustic Cabin. It was just a roadhouse in New Jersey, but it had a wire. It had a cable hookup to radio station WOR in New York City.
This is WOR Radio, New York City. Now the singing sensation of the moment, Frank Sinatra.
One of the avid listeners to WOR was band leader Harry James, a man always on the hunt for new talent.
He made his way to the rustic cabin one night, and he signed Frank Sinatra up to sing with his band.
The stint with Harry James lasted just 7 months before Sinatra's vaulting ambition got the better of him. James released him from his contract. But his next employer would prove to be much more difficult to get away from. In 1940, Frank Sinatra signed a contract to sing with the hugely popular Tommy Dorsey Band.
Tommy Dorsey was one of the most popular, if not the most popular, band leaders in the United States. Frank enormously coveted the notion of singing for him.
Sinatra idolized Tommy Dorsey for several reasons. Tommy Dorsey was a man's man. He was scared of nobody. If one of his band members gave him guff, he would punch him right out. He was a poker player. He was a stayer-up all-nighter. He was a ladies' man. He was a hard drinker.
Dorsey regimented people. He liked his musicians and his singer to wear the Dorsey band uniform. Frank didn't want to do that. Frank also got too big for his boots. He got into fights with other musicians. And eventually, he got so big for his boots that Dorsey had had enough of him, and there was an angry parting of the ways.
He had become this star. Everybody was looking at him. Everybody was cheering for him. He wanted to go out there. He felt that he could go out there and really make a name for himself as a solo singer.
At the end of 1942, when Frank wanted to strike out on his own, Dorsey was furious. Frank's friends intervened.
Sinatra knew how to call upon the power that he needed, and he did want to leave Tommy Dorsey, and he knew he could make it big on his own, and he was determined to do it. And Dorsey wasn't going to let him go.
Dorsey said, well, you're breaking your contract by leaving me, and therefore you'll owe me X% of what you earn for so many years to come. And according to Dorsey, it was Willie Moretti who came to him with a couple of other stiffs and held a gun to his head and said, you're going to let that boy go.
Tommy Dorsey was no fool. He backed off.
Frank was soon the most popular solo singer in the country, the equivalent of the international pop superstars of today. Everywhere he went, he was mobbed by an army of teenage female fans, known as the Bobby Soxers.
There were the screaming teenagers at the Paramount Theater in New York City. He got the contract in Hollywood. He had the great good fortune to sign with MGM, which made the best musicals. He had also the great good fortune to hook up with Gene Kelly, who really tutored him in screen acting. So he becomes this huge recording and movie star, and then it all falls apart for him.
With the Second World War at its full height, soldiers fighting overseas didn't like the fact that Frank had avoided the draft and remained safe in America. They saw him as a stay-at-home bum.
William Manchester, who wrote about the war in the Pacific, called Sinatra the most hated man in the armed services. Well, he was, but he was also loved and listened to by those soldiers and sailors and Marines. They felt very mixed about Sinatra. They all felt that he was screwing their women, and he was, right and left. It was a great time to be a single guy, even though he was married. It was a great time to be a guy on the make because there were 50 women for every healthy male. All the rest of the men were overseas. Sinatra made hay, he made whoopee during the war.
As World War II ended, American tastes were changing. The solo singer was replaced by new trends. Frank's career was in free fall. His style of singing was out of fashion. He was unpopular with GIs returning from the war. And his movie contract was on the brink of cancellation.
Musical taste in the wake of World War II changed enormously and changed very quickly, from sentimental songs to silly music. And suddenly Sinatra found himself out of fashion musically.
For a newly arrived American hero, however, things couldn't have been more different. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy had showed daring and courage in rescuing the crew of his patrol boat, PT-109, which had been mowed down by a Japanese destroyer in the South Pacific. Kennedy was being chosen by his father Joe to forge a career in politics. As the product of an Irish immigrant family, Joe Kennedy had experienced the same prejudices as the Sinatras and had defied the odds to become extraordinarily wealthy and extremely influential.
Joe Kennedy, one of the richest men probably in the world at that time, certainly in the United States, still felt the sting of being an Irish Catholic and knew that he would never be socially acceptable until he put one of his sons in the White House.
He wanted a name that would endure, either for himself, if he could rise and become the first Catholic president, or for his children.
John Kennedy's early life was everything Frank Sinatra's was not.
John F. Kennedy's early life was, of course, completely different from Sinatra's in the sense that he, JFK, was born into a fabulously wealthy family, went to the top schools, mixed in high society.
He was this very handsome young prince, had money to throw around. His father was a big deal in Hollywood. And Jack Kennedy had a gleam in his eye, a ready pile of cash, and he was very, very popular.
Easily elected to Congress after the war, by the early 1950s, the second-term congressman was planning a run for the Senate with his campaign team of Larry O'Brien, Dave Powers, and Kenny O'Donnell, collectively known as the Irish Mafia. Essentially, the Jack Pack.
They were young men who had survived World War II, who were determined to grab hold of the brass ring in American society, the upper tier. They were ready for it. They had a shared dream, and Jack was really the standard bearer of their dreams and ambitions.
As Jack Kennedy swept into the Senate in November 1952, Sinatra's career had dramatically fallen apart.
In very rapid order, he was dropped by his agents, he was dropped by his record label, and he was dropped by MGM Studios. He was dropped by everybody. He had no more career.
But Sinatra had made other serious misjudgments, one of which would further damage his reputation in the eyes of his fans and the American public, and haunt him for the rest of his life. With his career all but over, Sinatra compounded his woes with a number of serious misjudgments.
Out in Hollywood, he made a comment about Louis B. Mayer, the boss of MGM, that got back to Mayer. Mayer called him in the office and said, "That's it, you're out of here, goodbye, the contract's over." So he has no screen contract. And then he meets Ava Gardner, with whom he falls wildly in love. This breaks up his marriage.
Her career was like a skyrocket. It was heading straight up. She was 29 years old. She was at the peak of her physical perfection. And at the peak of her movie career, she was making a lot of money. And Frank, her new husband, was nowhere.
The relationship continued in storms of jealousy on both sides, but especially jealousy on Frank's side. And eventually, as was a psychologist, I think, would say, had been evident from the beginning, it was bound to blow apart, and eventually it did.
But it was a trip overseas which was to cause the most damage to his reputation.
He was asked, and he very happily agreed, to appear as the entertainment at a Mafia summit conference in Havana.
Cuba at that time was America's playground. The rich and famous used to go there. Of course, it was under the thumb of organized crime at the time.
There were a number of mobsters who were there, including Lucky Luciano. The myth is that Sinatra was carrying $2 million in cash to give to Lucky Luciano.
All of this would have stayed under the rug Had a correspondent for Hearst newspapers not been in Havana at the same moment trying to make contact with Ernest Hemingway, and one night in the Hotel Nacional in the restaurant happened to see, who should he see but Frank Sinatra and Lucky Luciano sitting together at a restaurant table.
The right-wing press in particular took Sinatra to task for these shady associations, and he thought, to hell with it, I am going to meet and associate with whomever I want. And he sort of like almost rubs their nose in it. He's going to say, okay, you want me to be this kind of stereotypical Italian-American gangster figure, I'm going to play along with it.
You're a dirty, lousy gangster.
And you're getting too fresh. So button it.
Attending the Havana conference publicly linked Sinatra to organized crime, a link that was later to destroy his most cherished dream.
He said, quote, "It's one of the dumbest things I did in my whole life."
Then, as the new senator's career rocketed, Frank began a remarkable comeback in early 1953.
Frank Sinatra's comeback is the stuff of legend, as they say. It probably is the biggest comeback in the history of pop culture. In Hollywood, the big thing was the role in From Here to Eternity.
There was great jockeying for the role of Maggio, and Frank Sinatra wanted it, and he even took Harry Cohn, the head of Columbia Pictures, which had optioned the book. He took him out to lunch, and he said, "Harry, I desperately I'll do anything to get this picture." And Cohn laughed in his face.
Ava Gardner went to Harry Cohn, and the exact quote was, "Listen," and she was a much bigger star than Frank at this point. She says to Harry Cohn, "Listen to me. There's only one guy that can play the role of Maggio. It happens to be the son of a bitch I'm married to. Give him the role."
But some of Frank's other friends might have helped things too.
There may have been a phone call to Harry Cohn. Harry Cohn was best friends with Johnny Rosselli, who was the mob's man in Hollywood. They wore matching friendship rings. They went to the racetrack together. Johnny Rosselli may have put in a word.
They gave the role to Frank Sinatra. He won the Academy Award. And that's when he became the Frank Sinatra we always think of, the superstar Frank Sinatra.
Later the same year, Jack Kennedy married Jacqueline Bouvier. If the rising star knew of Sinatra's mob associations, he wasn't showing it. And when the two were introduced by the senator's brother-in-law, actor Peter Lawford, in 1958, the attraction was instant.
Frank just knew right then, this is my generation. This is my guy.
The common denominator was beautiful women.
Jack Kennedy, he had enormous ambition and enormous sex drive. There's no way to use euphemisms for this. Getting laid was of the first importance to Jack Kennedy. Not just getting laid, but sleeping with the most beautiful women.
They were joined by a completely cavalier and unconfined appreciation for banditry among the female sex.
To say the least, they definitely indulged in the, let's say, the spoils of their respective fields. Unfortunately, it could get them, and did get them, into quite a bit of trouble.
Jack Kennedy loved the fact that Frank Sinatra was the epitome of the swinging bachelor. Women absolutely swooned at his feet. Sinatra loved the fact that Jack Kennedy was who he was and was destined to be president of the United States.
And as far as he was concerned, Frank Sinatra, who, as a plus, had this deep commitment to democratic politics, was a direct pipeline to the most beautiful women in Hollywood.
Two men who had a real understanding of raw power, and they had great fun.
Las Vegas had become the new gambling and entertainment capital of America, and the Nevada playground was where America's brightest political hope and his new pal began to hang out in the Mafia-owned Sands Hotel.
Sinatra had become part of Las Vegas, which was, along with Cuba, was the mob capital of the world.
Jack Kennedy's attractions, his urges, his pull toward glamour and glitz always leads him on. Vegas was an irresistible magnet.
It was part of the razzmatazz of a strange world in Hollywood and Las Vegas at a particular kind of time.
Keeping a close eye on the developing relationship between Sinatra and Kennedy was FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover.
Hoover was watching, and for anyone in the United States in that era to be watched malignantly by the director of the FBI was really bad news. As the reports began reaching him from his agents of the consorting in dubious circumstances between Sinatra and John F. Kennedy, he began storing up information that he could use primarily against the President of the United States.
And Hoover was watching on January 2nd, 1960.
I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
Within hours, Kennedy's good friend Frank Sinatra had pledged his unwavering support to the campaign. But their relationship and the good times they had shared together would come back to haunt them both, and Frank would come off the worst.
Everyone is voting for Jack, 'cause he's got what all the rest lack. Everyone wants to back Jack. Jack is on the right track, 'cause he's got high hopes. He's got high hopes.
As the 1960 Kennedy campaign moved into gear, Frank Sinatra was the candidate's most enthusiastic supporter.
He politics heavily for Jack Kennedy among his show business friends in California. He participates in fundraising events for Kennedy, more and more becomes involved with the campaign.
I think he rallies Hollywood, but even more importantly, I think he says to Italian Americans and maybe other immigrant groups, it's okay to vote for this guy. I can vouch for him. He's one of us.
The campaign took advantage of the candidate's charisma, as well as a slick election team. But as with all Kennedy campaigns, money would be the key ingredient, and Frank Sinatra would be the one to ensure it got into the right hands. In 1960, John F. Kennedy sought the Democratic nomination for President of the United States, and his most enthusiastic supporter was Frank Sinatra.
It was critical that Jack Kennedy win the Democratic primary in the state of West Virginia,
which was primarily a place of blue-collar, but primarily Protestant citizens.
It was a state that could go quite easily to Hubert Humphrey.
Key to winning West Virginia was Joe Kennedy's money.
In those years, Joe Kennedy could and did write a check for $10 million.
One of his aides once said that Joe believed that politics involved three things. The first was money, the second was money, and the third was more money.
Another significant factor in the campaign was Sinatra's underworld connections.
Joe Kennedy went to Frank Sinatra and said, "Can you speak to Sam Giancana about getting out the vote in West Virginia?"
Sam Giancana was a significant Mafia figure. An old friend of Frank, the two had first met on the Havana trip back in '47.
Frank Sinatra went to Sam Giancana, said, "We really need that vote turned out, 120,000 votes." And Giancana said, "Okay, I'll make sure the people go to the polls." Frank Sinatra said to Giancana, "Do not expect favors from the Kennedys. I'm asking you this as a personal favor." Giancana says, "Okay."
Despite his grueling campaigning schedule, Kennedy still found time to relax with his old friend. In February 1960, Sinatra was filming in Vegas when the candidate dropped by.
Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack in Las Vegas was the Mount Rushmore of men having fun.
Sinatra is in the process of making this movie, Ocean's 11. As the Rat Pack is really born, Sinatra, Lawford, Dean Martin, Joey Bishop, Sammy Davis Jr. all are convening in this one, and Jack Kennedy is there too. And, by the way, this is the first time that Jack Kennedy meets Judy Campbell. And who makes the introduction but Frank Sinatra?
The beautiful 26-year-old had been hanging around Sinatra's gang since the breakdown of her marriage.
You only have to look at the photographs of her as a young woman. She was a head-turner, a woman whom men looked at and admired the moment she walked into a room.
She had an affair with Frank Sinatra first. She maintains that she broke up the affair because he introduced a third woman into the bed equation.
She was enthralled by Jack Kennedy. She began to have an affair with Jack Kennedy.
But Campbell then began another relationship, which would ultimately prove disastrous for Frank Sinatra.
She started consorting with Sam Giancana, and that leads us into a twisting labyrinth of what swung the election in JFK's favor.
On the morning of Wednesday, November 9th, 1960, it was clear that John Kennedy had won the election.
The President-elect of the United States.
And Frank Sinatra was ecstatic.
Kennedy gets elected, and Sinatra is feeling on top of the world about this.
This is the ultimate power. This is the ultimate victory for democratic politics in the United States. We're in. He crows out to his friends, this is it. We're on our way to the White House.
Sinatra was tasked to organize the pre-inaugural gala in Washington, and with Lawford, pulled together a stellar lineup of Hollywood and Broadway stars.
There's Frank Sinatra, access to the president, calling on all his friends to sing and perform at the inauguration, and Frank Sinatra is running the show.
Sinatra appeared to be as in as anybody could be.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, Mr. John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
It was a very logical thing for Jack Kennedy to do, was to bring in Frank Sinatra to produce his inauguration, for the very simple reason that Sinatra had power in Hollywood, and a producer needs power. He needs to get everyone to do what he says they should do and get them to do it exactly on cue.
It's like a military operation, this gala. He gets every friend in show business, everybody from every walk of show business, musicians, movie stars, brings them all in this, again, military-like operation to Washington, D.C. to celebrate the inauguration of Jack Kennedy. And he, Frank, is at the center of it. As far as he's concerned, this may as well be his presidency as well as Jack Kennedy's.
I know we're all indebted to a great friend, Frank Sinatra. Long before he could sing, he used to poll a Democratic precinct back in New Jersey. That precinct has grown to cover a country. But long after he has ceased to sing, he's going to be standing up and speaking for the Democratic Party, and I thank him on behalf of all of you tonight. You cannot imagine the work that he has done to make this show a success.
He now has a place at the table. He's invited to sit at the table in a completely legitimate fashion.
One of JFK's key appointments to his cabinet was his brother. One of his brother's key targets was the Mafia.
Bobby Kennedy, who was made Attorney General, sets his sights on organized crime, and that includes Sam Giancana.
The mob saw itself as betrayed by the Kennedys, but also betrayed by the man they had seen as their go-between to John F. Kennedy, Frank Sinatra.
America was in love with the new president and his glamorous wife. And Frank Sinatra was basking in the glory of his friendship with JFK. Despite his punishing schedule as president, JFK continued to see Judy Campbell throughout 1961.
She met with Kennedy on many occasions.
Judith Campbell begins to visit the White House to have liaisons with the President of the United States.
Phone logs show that there were at least 75 phone calls between the two of them when he was in the White House. She really felt that Jack Kennedy was in love with her.
Watching the Kennedys and the presidential affair with Campbell was the man who had spied on presidents for a quarter of a century.
He had for a long time had evidence of JFK's, what he called whoremongering, his follies with women. And he saw this as something that he could hold over the president.
J. Edgar Hoover becomes aware that Judith Campbell is also intimate with Sam Giancana.
Hoover hated Sinatra. He regarded the singer as a debauched degenerate and despised his dubious connections. He had similar dislike of the Kennedys and regarded Bobby, his boss, as a privileged upstart. He now had what he needed to attack them. It was simply a matter of when. In spring 1962, President Kennedy was due to make a visit to California and some western states.
He's going there ostensibly to look at missile installations in New Mexico. What he's really excited about is R&R, rest and relaxation, in Palm Springs and in Hollywood.
The visit was going to include an overnight stay with Sinatra at his Palm Springs house. Kennedy was excited about the trip, scheduled for March 24th.
He's looking forward to having fun.
I mean, people knew that President Kennedy was going to be at Frank Sinatra's house.
He has had a helicopter pad built for the presidential helicopter. He's had quarters built for the Secret Service, everything in preparation for this visit.
And he really felt that his Palm Springs house would be known as the Western White House.
But 2 days before the trip, Hoover arranged to have a lunch meeting with the president at the White House.
J. Edgar Hoover knew what was going on between John F. Kennedy, Judith Campbell, Sam Giancana, Frank Sinatra, that whole menagerie, and went to Jack Kennedy and laid it on the table, and it was simply a question of blackmail.
Hoover told Kennedy that his agents had compiled a dossier which contained specific details of his extramarital activities, both before and since he had become president. It was immediately clear to Kennedy and his aides that Hoover's bombshell had the potential to destroy his populist image, his marriage, his presidency.
This is an inconceivably huge potential scandal for the President of the United States. Not only to be having adulterous relationships with a woman inside the White House, but to be connected with a woman who is intimately connected with organized crime in the United States. It's a scandal beyond imagining.
It was also clear that any links with Judy Campbell, Sam Giancana, and the common denominator, Frank Sinatra, would have to be severed, and fast.
When it came down to it, Kennedy was going to drop him like a hot potato if it in any way jeopardized his own political career.
When Hoover confronted the president with that report, my father went to Bobby, and that was that.
Having been informed of the content of the meeting by Kenny O'Donnell, he told the president that he could no longer afford to associate with Sinatra.
Bobby Kennedy tells his brother that he simply may not go back to Palm Springs and Frank Sinatra's house. It can't happen.
It was left to the presidential brother-in-law to be the messenger.
My dad and Bobby decided that Peter should make the call. Peter called Frank, and it didn't go well.
This was perhaps the most furious he had ever become.
Frank went into the rage of a maniacal king.
He really was so humiliated and so angry that he took a sledgehammer to the landing pad of his helioport.
Sinatra called Bobby to plead with him, but was pawned off with the same line Lawford had given, and the added insult that the president was now staying across the road at Bing Crosby's house.
The president would have to stay at Bing Crosby's because security was better and they couldn't really protect him at Sinatra's.
This simply was a stab in the back, a betrayal of the first magnitude, and that relationship could never be repaired.
Sinatra didn't blame the president, but he never forgave Bobby, and he never spoke to Lawford again.
My dad heard about all this, and he talked to Bobby about it, and Bobby basically said, you know, Peter will have to get new friends.
By 1963, contact between Frank and the White House had all but ceased, until one day in November.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
The news, now official. President Kennedy is dead.
Sinatra was filming in Los Angeles when he heard the news.
Sinatra went back to his place in Palm Springs, and according to his longtime valet, he essentially drank himself silly for days.
Frank Sinatra was enormously upset. I mean, he still felt great affection for John Kennedy and admired him tremendously.
Sinatra carried his hatred of Bobby Kennedy right across the 60s. He worked against him politically, even supporting his rival Hubert Humphrey in 1968.
Frank Sinatra hated the ground that Bobby Kennedy walked on, did not shed a tear when Bobby Kennedy was murdered.
He even changed political sides in the early 1970s. Such was his residual hatred.
He thinks that the Democrats in general and the Kennedys specifically have betrayed him, and so therefore he gravitates to people like Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon.
From then on, Frank is a Republican instead of a Democrat. The worm turns.
Decades on, the Kennedy brothers now enjoy mythical status. Their legacy, however tarnished in the interim, is frozen in time, and their political achievements outshine their personal indiscretions. But despite his stellar career, the unswerving devotion of his fans, and his legendary status, Sinatra never shook off his Mafia associations and would never again achieve the temporary respectability he had enjoyed during that brief period when he was Jack Kennedy's friend.
I think the end for him was very, very sad. His body gave out, dementia set in. He lost a lot of friends along the way. It was sad.
Sinatra is an extraordinary figure of 20th century history, a man who dominated the stage of entertainment in a way really not equaled by anybody else, except perhaps in the world of politics by John F. Kennedy. They are both in various ways still elusive characters, but what is sure is that they were joined by their flaw, their connection with organized crime, with the Mafia, and the way in which that joined them in their actions before and during the presidency. It was a mix that was sure to end in tragedy.